I'm standing out on deck as we flank the city walls. Seagulls glide overhead, guiding us in on our approach. The views on the skyline coming in thick and fast. This isn't just any boat trip. The place oozes history. It's a beautiful day. One of those very few throughout the year back home when it's not too hot, not too cold, just right. But that seems to be every day here. I can see why the ancients chose the place. On first glance, a visitor could be forgiven for mistaking this waterway for anywhere in the Mediterranean. That's when a massive Russian cargo vessel thunders by, bound for the Black Sea and the distant riverways of the far north beyond. Not too dissimilar to their longboat-wielding Rus predecessors from more than 1,000 years in the past. Of course, we're headed to the old city of Istanbul. Metropolis now and always. But it wasn't always called that. It's had many names over the years. One in particular, more long-lasting and iconic than the rest. Constantinople. Today, the sea lanes are filled with tourist boats, commercial vessels, and the occasional warship. But for most of its history, this was one of the world's premier waterways, the gateway to the Black Sea. Those who held it, by default, became rich and powerful. All they had to do was endure. It was a Roman capital for over 1,000 years. Greek colony before it, and probably some kind of a settlement long before that. And this is the Golden Horn, where Europe meets Asia. Site of so many sieges and world-defining conflicts over the long millennia. It's one of the most iconic seaways in the world. My name's Pete Kelly, and for the past 5 years or so, I've made it my mission to tell the stories of our ancestors, to travel to the great sites of the ancient world, and to bring you along for the ride. In October 2019, I made a trip here to a place I'd been reading about for more than a decade. The place I'd talked about in at least 50% of my work to date. Excited is an understatement. But on this journey, I'm not alone. I recruited my oldest friend to come along for the ride. Cruising along these waters, it's easy to envision Rus dragon boats, Venetian trading galleys, Byzantine fire dromons, and Ottoman warships, all those centuries ago. And oh, what delights the city itself has to offer. When I was a broke house sharer in my mid-20s, I lived next door to a kebab shop. Regularly, I'd wake up bleary-eyed and confused after quaffing one too many fine ales of an evening. Often, I'd be the first customer of the day for a breakfast kebab. I never did see any other customers in there. Maybe it was a drug front. Who knows? But kebabs still hold a dear place in my heart. Now I was headed where it all began, Istanbul.
Birmingham, yeah.
What does it mean to a Brummie? Football, history, great food, hospitality.
We've seen this done before, but in Surunch.
I've come here in search of footage and the elusive first kebab in history. Let's go. So, you're a history buff. What do you do when you first arrive in Istanbul? Get on the tram and go and see the Theodosian walls. Just do it. Still encircling the entirety of the old city are the finest surviving examples of Roman walls standing anywhere in the world. It's almost unbelievable to think that these mighty barricades, with only a few additions in the Ottoman era, have stood here since the days of Attila the Hun. Protecting the city for 1,000 years. They trace around the entirety of the old centre, snaking through neighbourhoods and overlooking highways. But just don't get lost when you get there. We're staying in the heart of the old city, of course. Where better? Although, the loudest family in the world are staying in the room above us, and the hotel staff give us a double bed to share. We can't shake off the feeling that they think we're a couple. I'm sure Marco Polo had the same problem. In search of breakfast, we leave the hotel, greeted by tour guides along the way, offering far-out journeys to deepest Anatolia. To the great Copper Age metropolises and world-renowned Stone Age temples the country has to offer. Built in a time when the horseback riding Turks still thundered across the wild steppes thousands of kilometres to the north and east. Because, of course, this city too has Neolithic foundations. And if you're a fan of prehistory, get yourself down to the excellent Museum of Archaeology. It's one of the most important collections in the world. And one of the best I've ever been to. Not just housing Hittite, Luwian, Phrygian, Greek and Roman items from all over Anatolia, but from all corners of the Ottoman Empire too. It wasn't just the British, French and Germans who amassed antiquities during their imperial age. The Ottoman Empire was one of the largest of all. Here you can find Sumerian, Assyrian, even pre-Islamic ancient Arabian artifacts. It's a massive place, and like every visit to the British Museum in London, I get the feeling that I'm really only scratching the surface of what's here. But ancient Anatolia isn't the focus of this trip. Not yet. That's for another day. This time we're focusing on the great city itself. Constantinople, as we know the place, on the European side of the Bosporus, was founded long after all of those ancient empires. In that sense, it's a newcomer, coming into existence only in the 7th century BC, in the mysterious centuries following the collapse of the Bronze Age world. It had a different name then too. Byzantium. It was founded by the Greeks. But don't tell the Turks that. In those bygone days, Greek settlers spanned all sides of the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean and Black Seas beyond, founding cities and trading centres with very little opposition. In the immortal words of Socrates, they were frogs sitting around a pond. In the future, the Mediterranean would be known playfully as the Roman Lake. But to begin with, it was all Greek. Having already plied the water roads since the mythic days of Jason and the Argonauts, and the Trojan War in the 2nd millennium BC, Byzantium became especially prosperous. Anyone wishing to go through to those cities on the Black Sea, of which there were a huge amount, along with other stranger places, homelands of fierce Scythians and proud Colchians, did so at the acquiescence of the rulers of the city. And of course, they grew rich. By the time of the expansion of the Roman Republic in the last few centuries BC, not just here, but all of Anatolia soon came under Roman influence, and the Byzantians, having little choice either way, made the decision to go with it. A modest-sized town then existed on this immensely strategically important location. Soon enough, ever growing in size and power, the place came under the direct control of the Romans. But like many places in the empire, those who'd come on side were largely allowed to continue as they had before, and rewarded for their loyalty. For with the peace of Rome came yet more riches. And for merchants and traders, there is nothing better than peace. By the 4th century AD, the stage was set for Byzantium's most glorious phase yet. Not far from where we're staying stand the ruins of the old Hippodrome, and a massive column erected here during the late Roman world. This is Constantine's column. And such was his fame and power that the city would be renamed for him, Rome's first Christian emperor. Though little remains now, in its day the Hippodrome would have been a sight to behold. A massive arena for games and civic ceremonies. A little like the Colosseum of ancient Rome, but for a more modern audience. Unlike the gladiatorial combat of the pagan past, another sport was favoured here. Arguably, no less brutal. The atmosphere of the chariot races of Constantinople must have been incredible to behold. The thundering of hooves, the din of the crowd. Not to mention the prolonged street battles that waged between die-hard factions of fans before and after the games. On one notable occasion in the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian nearly lost the city and his throne to these gangs of late antique hooligans, known as the Blues, Reds and Greens. Justinian ultimately ended up ordering tens of thousands of them to be massacred to save his empire. It puts modern football hooliganism to shame. And speaking of football, I'm with Joe after all, so we head to the ground of Fenerbahce FC, Ataturk's favourite team and rivals of Istanbul's other major player, Galatasaray. They take their football very seriously over here. Buses carrying players have been shot at before, and the violence of their fans has historically given ours in England a run for their money. Just like in Roman times, these guys are professionals, waging street battles between various factions. There isn't a game on while we're there, unfortunately, but we get a good sense of the place nonetheless. I think of the amphitheatre, the Colosseum, the chariot races, the screaming crowds. It's a pity the entire tour is in Turkish, but oh well. Just as the rest of the Roman Empire fell to pieces in the 5th and 6th centuries, riven by foreign invasions from beyond the Pale, the early Byzantine era is a fascinating and brutal time of opulence and majesty. Here, at a crossroads between Europe and Asia, the culture of the empire increasingly diverged from the West. Enthralled to an incoming class of Germanic warrior lords. Here, Greek became the main language, and Greek culture continued to rise in prominence. The evidence of those years can still be seen all over the city, if you look in the right places. We visit an incredible underground water cistern built by those Roman rulers close to 1500 years ago. Until roadworks dug this place up in the 19th century, no one had any idea it was here. Today, it's very touristy. I can't imagine the dour, zealous emperors of Eastern Rome would approve. But at least it survives, and you can visit. I'm reminded of the mines of Moria in Lord of the Rings. How amazing that this sort of technology was lost everywhere else in Europe when this was built. And soon it would be lost here too, for Byzantium has a strange history, in intermittent terminal decline for 1,000 years. Not far from the completely crowded Hagia Sophia and Blue Mosque, the nearby Mosaic Museum has so much to see from those Eastern days of late antiquity. Once upon a time, this had been an imperial palace, and the mosaics found here are some of the best preserved you can see anywhere. No one was in there at all when we visited to see the amazing classical images uncovered only very recently. Miraculously having remained hidden for so many centuries. Of course, they'd been covered up with good reason. If they'd been found earlier during the Ottoman era, they likely would have been destroyed. As far as I'm concerned, it's unfortunate that Islamic art doesn't generally allow the depiction of individuals. Even their own depictions from the 7th and 8th centuries have largely been destroyed. Because, well, this ban wasn't always the norm. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of amazing Islamic art. And we see a lot of it at the Museum of Islamic Art, one of my highlights of the trip. Incredible geometric stuff. But I do like a depiction of an individual, an early medieval monarch, an imam. I'd love to be able to see some of the early caliphs as depicted by their own contemporary artists. Such as did exist at places like the Umayyad Palace of the Frescoes in the Levant, and not those made hundreds of years later. But such is history. We also visit some of the oldest churches in the city. The Cora Church, where yet more recently uncovered mosaics can be seen. And another in a much more normal neighbourhood of Istanbul, almost completely forgotten. And more kebabs, of course. And ice cream. We round off the day in an authentic Ottoman restaurant. During the days of that later empire, so much had been inherited from their Roman predecessors. Outlandish, exotic dishes were common, drawn from all corners of the empire, perfected by armies of chefs in the pay of the upper echelons of high society. I try a traditional kebab. It's very different from my days in Sneinton. What a place. when the great city of Constantinople, declining in influence for centuries, was finally conquered by the Ottomans in 1453. In truth, the place was a shadow of what it had once been. Though still considered one of the great cities of the world, 250 years earlier it had been an even more impressive sight to behold. The greatest. But of course, 1200 was the time of the Crusades. And it wasn't just the Holy Land that bore the wrath of those zealous adventurers. Five years before, whilst passing through Venice on an interrailing trip around Europe, I witnessed for myself the majesty that had once stood in Constantine's city. Dragged there to St. Mark's Square from halfway across the Mediterranean, when the place was sacked during the Fourth Crusade. Not by Muslims, but by the Crusaders themselves. I also later passed through one of the sea empires which inherited the power once held by Constantinople. Its far-roaming trade ships and spice merchants filling the void left behind. Here once existed the city-state of Ragusa, better known today as Dubrovnik. For it wasn't just the Muslim Turks who really destroyed the power of the Eastern Empire, but their Western Catholic co-religionists. The complicated and intermingled story of Byzantium and the West is one of the great tragic tales of the High Middle Ages. For brief moments in the later 10th century, it looked like the entire empire might be reforged. Imperial houses of the East and the West united under a single family. Ancient Rome made anew. But, of course, it wasn't to be. Far too much had happened in the centuries since. By the time of the final schism of the 11th century, the two halves of Europe had already diverged so much in the 700 years since Constantine's day to be utterly unrecognisable. Almost every facet of life was different, not to mention politics, architecture, and the church. But how did it all happen? Well, let's find out. Where next to go on a trip to Istanbul? Of course, the Hagia Sophia, largest building in the world when it was built by Justinian in the 6th century. During a time when almost no buildings in stone were built in Western Europe at all. Still fewer that survive. An immensely impressive sight. When we went, the walls were still covered with incredible mosaics of Christian iconography and the Eastern emperors of old. This place was the heart of Orthodox Christianity for 1,000 years. I came looking for something else too. evidence of one of the most interesting bodyguards of the medieval world. A hereditary institution for hundreds of years. Kingmakers and Viking marauders. Of course, I came searching for the Varangian Guard. It's almost unbelievable to think that this graffiti was etched here 1,000 years ago by bored Norsemen. I can imagine them sitting back, watching one of the endless droning sermons in a language they didn't even understand. No wonder they etched these famous runes, recording their presence here for posterity. But what do they say? Well, this one simply reads, Halfdan was here. Even by that time, this city had weathered siege after siege, attack after attack, all through the early Middle Ages, for well over 500 years. From fearsome Huns and Avars to persistent Arab caliphs and Bulgar Khans. And by the 11th century, the imperial house stood under very real threat of losing its authority altogether to a new breed of usurper warrior generals from within the aristocracy. Magnates like John Tzimiskes and Nicephorus Phocas, whose immense military power and sometimes popularity threatened to turn the imperial position into one akin to the popes in the West. After a series of spectacular downfalls and civil conflict, however, under the firm rule of the young reigning emperor Basil II, later to be known as the Bulgar Slayer, a ruler who fused the hereditary might of the imperial house with the power of the military, it would all be turned around. It's amazing to know that many buildings here still survive from that time, well over 1,000 years ago. And yet, the glory days of reconquest were to be brief. A mere generation or two, before the rot of bureaucracy and cronyism kicked in again. Following Basil's expansionist reign, a number of weak, ineffectual emperors ruled. Their machinations and politicking every bit as Shakespearean as later high medieval rulers in the West. As fascinating as this era is, the imperial apparatus was rotting from within. By the 1070s, heralded by outriders for nearly 100 years already, a great wave of newcomers arrived. The flames of burned out cities in eastern Anatolia, signalling their advance. A new age was about to dawn, for the Turks had arrived. Another must-visit museum in Istanbul I mentioned earlier, not far from the Hagia Sophia, is the Museum of Islamic Art. And in this museum, alongside all manner of amazing artwork, from Muhammad to the Ottomans, all through the Islamic era, we have one of my favourite cultures of all. That of the Seljuk Turks. Many of the carvings here come from the city of Iconium, modern-day Konya, in central Anatolia, that would soon be established as a capital by those Turkic invaders from the steppe. And in these artworks, we get a unique glimpse into their culture. Very different from the more established Muslim cultures of the region. Adherents to Islamic dogma, these newcomers were not. Like Irishmen and Vikings during the early Middle Ages, they'd accepted the Abrahamic faith on their own terms. And they didn't play by many of its strictest rules. They simply didn't have to. Militarily supreme, having taken on the mantle of saviours of the Sunni faith against the heretical Shiite Fatimids in Egypt, they didn't have to answer to anyone. Islamised steppe warriors, the Seljuks had far more in common with the Christianised Norsemen in the Varangian Guard than it might first appear. Their artists and artisans didn't adhere to the strict rules on individualistic art. They often drew and sculpted animals and people, and it's really impressive stuff. And like the Vikings, their art is more derived from the animal art style of the steppe than the world of the city builders. Its roots lying in the wilds of the Altai Mountains, rather than the cities of Mesopotamia. In 1071, when the forces of the Sultan Alp Arslan, triumphant in battle against rivals in his own family, faced off against Eastern Roman Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes on the plains of Manzikert, it was the steppe tactics of the Turks that won the day. Tens of thousands of horse archers encircled the emperor again and again, hacking into his forces, much of which were comprised of mercenaries who soon abandoned him. But Alp Arslan, he didn't kill Romanus, sending him back to the city with gifts and a peace settlement instead. His enemies were the Fatimids in Egypt. When Romanus returned to the city though, he was blinded by political rivals, dying in agony from his wounds. Engulfing the empire into civil war. When Alp Arslan too died the next year, the peace treaty went with him, opening the door to a torrent of further Turkic invasions into Anatolia. From then on, Constantinople's history became a complicated one of playing off the Turks against the Westerners. Now invited in by the new emperor Alexius Comnenus as a last-ditch effort to save his empire. A new type of ruler who'd been born in the chaos. Alexius actually numbered Turks in his personal retinue, and had often fought alongside them against Normans during his lengthy career in Anatolia. The invitation that he sent to the West was enthusiastically taken up by not only princes and lords, but the Pope himself. Whether Alexius liked it or not, the First Crusade was on the way. In one of the most impressive logistical feats of the age, Alexius, who really had just wanted a small group of hardened warriors, not a flood of humanity, did all he could to move the Westerners on through his lands as quickly as possible. He was successful, but not all of his successors would be. A 100 years later, another invitation to the city was extended. This one by a deposed emperor seeking to reclaim his throne by any means necessary. Initially aiming for Egypt, the Fourth Crusade, a mostly Venetian and Frankish affair, agreed to stop off en route to install Alexius IV, in return for a hefty fee, of course. The problem was, Egypt was so far away, and when the newly instated emperor couldn't pay up, negotiations broke down, and the city was put to the sword. For some of the men taking part in the siege, horrified at how events had played out, their crusade had been a holy mission after all. They turned around in disgust and left. For the others, motivated by a hunger for gold and riches, Constantinople would do nicely. Contemporary writers like Geoffrey Villehardouin and Robert de Clary describe in vivid detail the variety of tortures and violence meted out against the Holy City. It would never be the same again. Never again unified into a whole. Divided as it was into a number of successor states. One of which, at Trebizond on the Black Sea, would actually outlive Constantinople. For a number of years to come, Constantinople was shamelessly ruled over by a new Latin emperor. The first of which, though, Baldwin I, after a savage defeat by the newly independent Bulgarian state, disappeared into captivity, living out the rest of his days imprisoned in a bleak tower. His head allegedly turned into a drinking cup. For of course, the Bulgars now saw their opportunity to solidify their new Second Empire, permanently taking the lands north of Constantinople and ever threatening the great city. For the exiled Roman nobles ruling over the Greek peninsula, the next century would be spent waging perennial wars in an attempt to reclaim the place. In those decades, conflict raged between Byzantine holdouts and Western claimants. Not to mention Venetian merchant lords, Seljuk sultans, and Bulgar khans. When the Byzantines finally succeeded in getting the place back, the world had moved on. It was a shell, no longer the greatest in the world. By that time in the 14th century, though the great city was back in imperial hands, Anatolia was completely lost, and much of the islands and mainland Balkans, never to be reclaimed. They might not have realised it, but when those Roman warriors took the city back, celebrating their glorious victory, the end was already on the way. Out on the steppes of Anatolia, a new clan began rising to the fore amongst the Turkish beyliks, ruled by a powerful political mastermind. His name was Osman. His descendants would form one of the most powerful empires the world would ever know, bringing Europe to its knees. From then on, until the end of its independence in the 15th century, the capital hung on by the skin of its teeth, its immense walls and stature allowing it to survive, increasingly backward, hemmed in an ever-changing new world. Another must-do for a trip to the great city. Well, a boat trip, of course. Istanbul is full of them. We cruise out along the Golden Horn, skirting along the seaward walls into a view of both European and Asian sides of the city. Two worlds, united today by a massive bridge. But back in the 15th century, they were worlds apart. One side, besides the small Genoan colony of Galata, was under the control of the Turkic Ottoman Sultanate. The other, the Romans, just as it had been for well over 1,000 years. A huge chain crossed over the harbour back then, stopping any unwanted visitors from making it in, while protecting friendly vessels within. A little further down the coast, we see our first view of those Ottoman rulers. This is Rumeli Fortress, completed by the Sultan Mehmed II in 1452, to dominate this artery of trade. It was one of the final set pieces in a lengthy, protracted attempt to strangle the great city. Once completed, anyone attempting to get into the place from the north had to run a gauntlet of guns and war vessels arrayed by the shore. We stop off and have a delightful lunch. And then we crack on. Aside from having an excellent taste in hats, the young Mehmed II was absolutely determined to take Constantinople. Obsessed with Alexander the Great from a young age, a similarly teenaged emperor, he saw himself as the great conqueror of his age. Having dreamt of taking the city as a boy, when he became Sultan at just 19, he decided he was the chosen one to do it, dedicating all of his time to the task. Despite the fact that so many of his predecessors had tried and failed over the previous century, conquering vast swathes of the Balkans instead, undaunted, Mehmed set his plans to action. Alongside his battle-hardened army of tens of thousands of men, Mehmed had a large navy and a secret weapon. The largest guns the world had ever seen, constructed by a Hungarian armourer, specifically designed to bring the walls down. But the Romans wouldn't go down without a fight. Alongside elite household warriors, vestiges of the vaunted legions of old, battle-hardened Genoan mercenaries fought for their livelihoods and their homes. They'd lived inside the city for generations. And the walls themselves were still immensely strong, able to withstand anything thrown at them. So the defenders thought. And of course, despite the dizzying odds stacked up against them, morale was high. The defenders firmly believed they had God on their side. However, after a lengthy siege, a breach was made. Mehmed clutched victory from the verge of defeat. Constantine, the last Roman emperor, charged to his doom. Heading into where the fighting was thickest, never to be seen again. Upon taking the city, Mehmed was relatively lenient for the time. Of course, the place was sacked and many sold into slavery, but not everyone was killed, and the architecture largely survived. The place was to be his crowning glory after all. The churches were changed to mosques, and it became the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. Thus began the golden age of the Ottomans. For hundreds of years, by far the most powerful state on the European mainland, and a perennial existential menace to the various states of the Balkans and Eastern Europe. That seemingly never-ending advance into Christian Europe wouldn't be truly ended until the 17th and 18th centuries. Only its slightly awkward geographical position halted the Ottomans from claiming an overseas empire in the Americas, thus losing out in the slow battle of capitalism on the waves, fought by the European powers. Though the Ottomans had a massive empire of their own, they tended to look to the east rather than the west. Today, though Roman buildings like the Hagia Sophia are wildly impressive, some of the greatest architecture in the city dates from that Ottoman era. The Blue Mosque, completed in 1616 by the Sultan Ahmed I, is one of the most impressive. And we see a number of other immensely impressive sites. One of my favourite places of the trip is the Museum of Islamic Science, an incredible insight into the fascinating world of Muslim technological achievements. We see devices ranging from the Ottoman era all the way back into the days of the Abbasid caliphs, hundreds of years before. A similarly majestic age of immense intellectual achievement. This artefact isn't from the Age of Discovery, though they were used then too. This is an astrolabe, used to navigate the high seas, and it's over 1,000 years old. In the 9th century, whilst Europeans fought off Norsemen and Magyar horse riders during one of the darkest centuries they'd ever known, Muslim mariners explored and mapped the world, amassing books and knowledge under the Abbasid Caliph Al-Mamun. saving many of the classic works of the ancient world for us to read today. And, most amazing of all for me, a sight I'd been dreaming of. Here is a replica of the very first kebab maker in history. Truly, those Ottomans were an advanced people. Yet, all things must come to an end. And by the 19th century, it was the Turks who'd fallen behind. Like the Romans before them, they were now the dinosaurs in this new age of commerce. Financial adventurers of the other European powers spanned all over the globe. Their railways and steamboats chugging around every sea and continent, and now it would be European engineers who'd arrive in Anatolia to sell their services, to improve the ageing, sometimes still essentially medieval infrastructure. The Ottomans began to be called the Old Man of Europe. We pass by a massive palace from the later years of that empire. We're told the entire thing was cast in bronze and brought here from Vienna. The empires of the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans cooperating during this time, and relations prospering. Towards the end of our boat trip, we stop off at another massive palace. It's not too dissimilar to stately homes I've seen all over Britain. And there are other similarities too to the age of Victoria. This is a relic of a time when similarly conservative political leaders ruled a similarly vast and sprawling empire. But that Ottoman Empire would soon be dead. In the First World War, the Ottomans lost out. Their technological disparity quickly showing through. The Germans had helped them build railways in the decades before the war. But they'd picked the losing horse. Despite their devastating defeat of the British at Gallipoli, the Russians made advances in the east, and the Armenians declared independence. Soon enough, the entire empire would be lost, carved up between Brits and French, leading to the bizarre situation of immaculate straight-lined borders that we have today, drawn in the sand by French and British diplomats with very little knowledge of the region. Like many places in the world, Turkey's Great War didn't truly end until the mid-1920s, by which time a brutal civil war had raged with the Greeks who once lived all over the country, and genocidal fury directed against Armenians. And out of that chaos, a new order and a new ruler emerged. One who would Latinize the Turkish alphabet and modernize the country. A friend to Churchill and a snubber of Hitler. He was Ataturk, still revered today as the father of modern Turkey. But today, that new secular Turkey is increasingly at risk. Who knows what the future will hold? As always, I leave Turkey filled with awe. I can't wait to return. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, it really does help me out. And let me know where you'd like to see me visit next. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.